Oxygen Blast technical seminars are an Intertech production. For instructor-led .NET, Java, and XML courses, visit us at www.intertech.com.
A real simple and very common AJAX example is where maybe you have some sort of a button and a text field, you want to send some information to a server, and when the server is done processing it, you get the response. You want to put some sort of a message somewhere in the page. So for example, I've got a simple username text box, and I've got a button for submitting a username. And what I want to do is, once that button is clicked, I want to call a JavaScript function called submit username. That's going to handle creating the AJAX request. And that would look something like this. So in my AJAX request, I first have to grab that value. So I grab using document get element by ID. Again, this is the traditional JavaScript example before we show you the jQuery equivalent. So I grab that username, I put it inside of a URL, I construct my object so that I can make an AJAX request. You'll notice here that at the very bottom, I've got a function created, get XML HTTP request. I didn't bother to fill in the code there, but you can imagine that it's custom code to figure out what client browser is being used and what the appropriate XML HTTP request object is for that particular browser, maybe an ActiveX object if it's an older IE browser. But the point being that I need to do a little bit of branching in my code to be able to send this AJAX request for all the browsers I want to support. So again, I have the username, I've created the URL, I've configured my request object, I've registered my callback function. Again, if you're not familiar with AJAX, and this might sound a little strange, but we will be moving on to DOM in just a second, so hold on for the rest of the people. So we have our callback function. Once the callback function is called, I need to check the ready state, because I need to make sure that the request is completed. That is the number 4. I need to check that status just to make sure that the status is 200. And once that all works out, I grab a particular div, maybe it's a div or a span tag, and I stick in whatever came in the response into that area. So again, very, very typical AJAX scenario. Get a feel for all the code that you see there, and again, remember that final method, get XML HTTP request, I haven't even bothered to put in all the code that would be used to implement that. Here's what it would look like to do the exact same thing in jQuery. This is it. This one line right here does everything we saw above. So what it's going to do is it's going to grab a element, a div element. In this case, I call it status. And what I want to do is load some response into it. So .load is the method. The method takes 2 parameters, a URL that you want to call, and optionally, you can add a callback function if you need it. But again, for those simple scenarios, you're just really, the only reason we're creating callback functions is simply so that we can load that information into a particular placeholder on our web page. One note about the load method is that the callback function, if you include it, is going to be called even if the request is unsuccessful. So you'll need to handle that appropriately. You'll notice also that I have a method val here. We didn't really talk about that, but val is really the same thing as the .value property in the DOM API. It looks at a particular element and grabs that value out. So the main point being here is, again, jump back to this code. Traditional JavaScript, jQuery. Write less, do more. For some more complex scenarios, you may find that you need other functions, and jQuery does provide them. You should look up the .get, which will execute a GET request, and .post. One main difference between the GET and POST is that you don't attach this to a particular element. They're just global functions that you call. Another difference is that the callback function you would pass in there is not executed if the request is unsuccessful. So that's a little bit about AJAX. Let's jump into the DOM document object model, creation and manipulation. So if we think about typical DOM scenario where we're wanting to create some nodes and eventually put it in a page, there's usually 3 steps. The first step is we need to create each node needed. and that's going to be all of our elements. We may have text nodes, we may have attribute nodes. We need to create each and every one, and then once we have them, we need to assemble these nodes into some sort of a tree structure. Finally, once we have that tree structure, we need to find something in the page that can act as a placeholder or handle and push our tree into that so that it can be displayed. Let's focus on the first two steps here. So the first two steps, we have a very simple script here where I'm creating a div element, a strong element, and then I also create a text node. Once I've created all the elements that I need, then I can start to arrange them in a tree structure by using the append child method. Again, very simple, very typical scenario. Here's how I can do it in jQuery. A lot simpler. So what I'm able to do here is just put in the text of the strings that I want, and it will create all the elements that I need. So this is the equivalent, what you're seeing here, as what you're seeing in this typical DOM scenario. There's one slight difference that you should keep in mind when you're using the syntax, and that's the way it's really treated under the covers is that it's creating an element and sticking the rest of those other elements you see in here, the div, the strong, the text, hello, and what it's doing is it's putting it as inner HTML. So there are some limitations with that, of course. So there are other methods available that you can use. Remove attribute, add an attribute, prepend, append, insert before, insert after. Let's look at some code examples for these. So here's a very simple DOM example where I've got a div element, some text, and then a child div. And what you see below is just sort of an object representation of this syntax. So I've got my div element right here with main ID, has a child of some text, also has another child of a div tag as well with its own text. All right, so what will these other methods do? First one I want to show you is prepend to and prepend. I pair these together because they do the same thing. They create the same result. They just go about it in a little different way. And the way that they go about it that's different is really where they're going to stick in their new HTML. So with prepend to, you'll notice the first thing I have is my, here we go. With prepend to, I have the HTML that I want to create. I say dot prepend to, and then I pass in the element where I want to prepend my new text to. Whereas prepend goes in just the exact opposite direction. You start with the element that you want to add all of your new stuff to, and you prepend the new HTML that you've created. In either case, though, it's going to create the same thing. It's going to create some new elements and stick them as the first child of the element that you're sticking them with, in this case, the main div. So that's prepend to and prepend. We have append to and append, and that's going to do pretty much just the opposite. It's going to take the element that you've specified, and it's going to stick it as the very last child for that element. So append to and append. We have insert before, and of course, that's just going to give you a little bit more granularity. You find a particular div. Let's look at the before. In this case, I say I want to find the div with an ID of another div, and before that, I want to stick this brand new HTML. So where does that go? It goes right in the middle. It goes right before this another div element. A little bit about the DOM. Let's talk about event handling. So what is an event handling scenario? Events are anything that happens with the elements on your page. So when you click a button, an event happened, an on-click event happened. When you take your mouse and you pass it over an image, a mouse-over event happened. So everything that happens with the interaction on your page, that throws an event. And what do we do with the events? We want to handle them in some sort of way. We want to maybe, when someone clicks a button, we want to call our particular JavaScript function. So we set up event handlers. In traditional JavaScript, there are a couple different ways you can do this programmatically. One way that you could do this is set an event handler property on any HTML element object. So let's say I have a button and I get it through the get element by ID, grab that button and I call dot on click. That's a property that says, hey, whenever this button is clicked, I want you to call the handler that I'm passing by. In this case, I'm setting load new stock quote. The limitation here is that if I call .onClick on the same button again, I will overwrite whatever handlers have been previously set. So you're only allowed to set a single event handler per event type. Now, I could create an inner function here that has multiple event handlers as well, but the main point being, as soon as I call .onClick again, I'm going to overwrite what's already there. So if I wanted to add multiple handlers programmatically, then what I would typically do is use a browser-specific method that would allow me to attach multiple handlers. Get a code example of that. So for example, in IE, I would have a method called attach event. And attach event takes two parameters, event type and event handler. You'll notice that I'm attaching two handlers. One is for an on-click, and another is for an on-mouse over. And what that's going to do is it's just going to keep adding more and more events as I keep attaching them. Problem is that it's not going to be supported in Mozilla. With Mozilla, I'm going to need to use add event listener. And so add event listener has its own syntax where you pass in an event type, event handler, and whether or not you want it to bubble, whether or not you want it to propagate.
For more free learning resources and to see the latest lineup of our instructor-led .NET, Java, and XML courses, visit us at www.intertech.com.